I'm here with Dr. Maha Nassar. Maha is an associate professor in the School of Middle Eastern and North African Studies at the University of Arizona. And she is also non-resident fellow at the Foundation for Middle East Peace. Maha, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I wanted to start by asking you what is new and what is not new in these election results.
Well, not new is Netanyahu. This is now, he was already the longest serving prime minister in Israeli history, and he's going to now extend that run. A new name and a new person that we've been hearing a lot more about is Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is the head of the religious Zionist party that received the third largest share of Knesset seats. He's been someone that Palestinians in particular have been having their eye on for quite some time, even though he might be a newer name to some of our podcast listeners. So Ben-Gvir has been part of a rapidly growing movement of extremist religious Zionists, and I don't think it's a coincidence that his party's name is Religious Zionism. And so these extremist religious Zionists have, for quite a while now, been seeking to impede Muslim access to Jerusalem, and especially access to the Haram Sharif or the Temple Mount. And there are some elements within this movement that even wish to destroy the mosques that are there, the Dome of the Rock and the Aqsa Mosque, in order to replace them with the third Jewish temple. So these movements have also been under a lot of people's radars for a long time, but a lot of the news we've been hearing over the past couple of years, for example, about Israeli police attacking Muslim worshippers at the Aqsa Mosque compound, are in fact a direct result of incitement by members of some of these movements. And oftentimes Ben-Gvir is in the midst of it. So for example, a few weeks ago, just in October, Ben-Gvir was one of several extremist settlers who stormed the courtyards of the Aqsa Mosque under the protection of Israeli police and in clear violation of the agreements between Israel and the Jordanian Waqf authorities, who are responsible for the administration of the compound. And then last year, when we heard about Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah defending their homes from being taken over by Israeli settlers, those confrontations, which were coupled with a march of extremists in Jerusalem, and that led to the latest Israeli war on Gaza. So while all of that was happening, again, Ben-Gvir was in the midst of it. At the time, the police commissioner, Kobi Shabtai, placed blame for the outbreak of violence directly on him, saying, quote, "The person responsible for this intifada is Itamar Ben-Gvir," unquote. So, and that was because Ben-Gvir had moved his parliamentary office to Sheikh Jarrah, which incited Jewish settlers to be even more violent in their attempt to take over the East Jerusalem neighborhood. So there's a lot of talk right now about Ben-Gvir entering the government, entering Netanyahu's coalition. There's some hope, I think, in some quarters that he'll somehow be shut out. But either way, I think we're going to see an increase in these incendiary moves. And I think this increases the likelihood of further armed conflict, and not just with Gaza. So while I don't think we'll see a regional war erupting on behalf of protecting Palestinians as its sole cause, I think that if there is a real fear in the Arab and Muslim worlds that the Aqsa Mosque itself is under threat, then I can see Muslims all over the world pushing their governments to do something, which could in fact lead to a wider war. I've also noticed a line of analysis in the Arab world that were there to be a regional war or a regional armed conflict, that Israel's traditional superiority in weapons, both conventional and nuclear, wouldn't be as effective against some of these newer, smaller weapons like drones. So the Iranian drones that we've been hearing about in Ukraine, for example, could potentially be used against Israel. Now, I'm not a military expert, so I don't know for sure. I can't evaluate these claims. But it seems to me that Israeli military officials are also exercising caution. That would explain why the Lapid government agreed to US-mediated talks with Lebanon about the maritime border with Israel and refrained from unilateral actions until an agreement was reached. And so I don't know that a Netanyahu government, with or without Ben-Gvir, would be as circumspect.
Great. Thank you for all of that, Maha. That was very helpful. So what are you keeping your eye on? Like as we see, we're going to see what this government is and becomes, and we'll know more obviously in the coming days. But what are you watching? What are the trends?
One thing I'm watching with quite a bit of interest, I'm sure I'm not the only one watching this, I'm watching the reaction among American supporters of Israel, Jewish American supporters in particular, but sort of supporters more broadly, both inside and outside the Beltway. So, for example, I noticed quite a bit of alarm coming out of the Washington Institute, which is a traditional pro-Israel think tank. Yesterday, Dennis Ross and David Makovsky wrote that they feared that a Netanyahu government, especially with Ben-Gvir in the coalition, would strain US-Israeli relations. They noted that Abdullah bin Zayed, the foreign minister of the UAE, had warned Netanyahu during a trip to Israel before the election that the inclusion of Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, the co-leader of that religious Zionism party, would affect the relationship with the Emirates. So I think there's a lot of concern that the Abraham Accords that people in Washington have been spending a lot of political capital to shore up and are already under threat. They're increasingly unpopular in the Arab world. So I think there's a real possibility that those are going to fall through altogether. There's also a lot of concern that progressives and other liberal Americans who have been increasingly critical of Israel and accusing it of apartheid, of Jewish supremacy, of discrimination, that those voices will get louder and will be taken more seriously when you have someone as blatantly racist as Ben-Gvir in government. But I'm also interested in the intra-Jewish conversations that are happening as well. I was reminded, as I was thinking about Jerusalem in particular, I was reminded about what happened last summer when 3 young American Jews went to the part of the Western Wall for their bar and bat mitzvahs, and they were yelled at and called names by a group of ultra-Orthodox Haredi teenage youth. And it was a very trying experience, certainly for the young people involved, but I think for the wider American Jewish community as well. The US Special Envoy on Anti-Semitism, Deborah Lipstadt, tweeted at the time that she was deeply disturbed by the troubling actions of a group of extremists at the Kotel. And she also, and I think this part was really interesting, she continued, and I'm quoting here, "Let us make no mistake, had such a hateful incident, such incitement happened in any other country, there'd be little hesitation in labeling it anti-Semitism," unquote. Similarly, ADL condemned the actions. I imagine there was a lot of back channel and private communication happening between members of the American Jewish leadership and the Israeli government to try to rein in these youth. I think in the current government, those youth are not going to be reined in. And if anything, it's going to exacerbate the kinds of splits that we're already seeing, not only between the right in Israel and liberal American Jews, but also within Israeli Jewish society itself, between liberal or secular or non-practicing Jews and those who think that there's only one way to practice Judaism. So on top of all of the incitement and violence that's going to probably fall on the Palestinians, there's also, I think, a huge likelihood that we're going to see intra-Israeli, Jewish-Israeli violence happening as well.
Thank you for all of that. So my last question for you is, what's the takeaway of, if you were to give one message to an American audience, whether that be your students or everyone listening here, what do you think is the most important thing people need to know to take away from these elections?
I think the most important thing for everyone, regardless of your political affiliation, regardless of what you think about Israel up until now, I think the most important thing to know is that any pretense of the United States and Israel sharing liberal values, that era is over. I would have said it was over a long time ago, but certainly now I don't think there's any doubt, and I don't think there's any real cause or reality to say, as many in the Beltway often do, that the United States and Israel have a set of shared values, implying sort of shared liberal values. I think that era is over. I don't think it's ever coming back.
Thank you, Maha. Very powerful to hear you and to hear your words. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you.